that's mine.
I know, but so we used to have 2 owners.
We did, and then we loaned them. 2 people took them. We haven't gotten them back.
Thank you for catching that. So we're on for Monday, and then tomorrow.
I just need clarification that I can help. But since you're going to find that out,
Oh, I don't know. Is it cat fur?
thank you.
Oh, it's not cat fur.
Ugh. I keep pushing this stuff out of the way and they keep pushing it in front of me. Take it away.
So we do have one out. And I noticed that the other night that you only had 2. One winner and there.
Okay, this will be fun.
You can give it.
Okay. All right.
I need one desperately. I've got the actual hard pack in there. Nothing like analog.
You're a team player. Old school, right?
Just be sure she knows to give it back to me.
I'm gonna
We'll
tell
need
her
it for
that.
tomorrow.
For sure.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rod. If you can tomorrow work on that, I appreciate it. Time sensitive.
We'll get, we'll draft it. I don't know if it'll come from me or from Brian, but we'll draft it to make it easy.
Thank you, Rod. Thanks for your call yesterday, Chris. I know you're busy.
What changes were done to team up? It's quite a large thing.
It is, yeah.
So,
You know, I had absolutely nothing to do with any of the papers in this agenda.
They didn't run that by you?
They never do. They never include, I don't see it until you see it.
Okay, well, it's up online.
Okay, I did, you know, I did see the audit. I mean, yeah.
Oh, the audit, yeah, that was, yeah.
One more I know to add to your collection. That goes at the back.
Look at that, team up. Just what we were talking about.
Oh, okay, thank you. Very back.
So now I guess we'll find out
Yeah.
what the changes are now.
I don't know if it's the last one we have.
Oh, sorry.
Could be more coming, huh?
Red light is on.
Oh,
Sorry, guys. Can you just add that to the back of your post-meeting?
Okay.
Thank you. I don't know if that's the last one you receive or not.
that's the first thing, the audit.
Yes.
Got more pink and, look at this. It's the audit. I had fun with the audit. Lots of fun. What's that?
Remember the microphones.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're in trouble.
Everyone ready? Welcome, everybody, to our very first Independent Santa Clara Stadium Authority meeting. You're here at a moment in history today, since we have separated the Santa Clara Stadium Authority from the City of Santa Clara agenda. So it's the first and first of many meetings, so welcome. We are going to start our meeting with the 5 o'clock study session, a confirmation of quorum.
Mayor Gilmore, confirming a quorum.
Okay. So announcement of the study session, we are going to be talking about this evening the Measure J compliance audit for Levi Stadium. So Authority Director.
Executive Director, yes. Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. As you mentioned, this is our first Stadium Authority Board meeting, and this is the study session to talk about the Measure J compliance audit, which is prepared by Harvey M. Rose. The board retained the services of Harvey M. Rose in July of 2016. And so since then, the board also created a stadium audit ad hoc committee with Chair Gilmore, Board Member O'Neill, and Member Kolstad on that. And there have been progress reports prepared by Harvey M. Rose. And in May, we saw a draft of the report, and comments were exchanged with the consultant, with the auditor. And they have incorporated most of those. And now there's a final report, which is in your packet. And for the public, it's on the web. So there are members of Harvey M. Rose team here. Let me introduce Mr. Fred Brousseau. He's the principal and principal author of this report. With him is Dan Goncher. I know they have another staff member I have not met, but I'll leave it to Mr. Brousseau to introduce. And on staff side, Angie Kretsch, who has played a key role in review and helped staff comments and all the other things, and worked very closely with Harvey and Rose. So she's here, along with Ruth Chikara, our assistant city manager. So if you have any questions of staff, we'll come in and try to answer those as well. So with
Thank you.
that, if I could.
Welcome.
Thank you. And thank you, Rajiv. Chair Gilmore, members of the board, I'm Fred Brousseau from Harvey M. Rose Associates. I was the principal in charge for this audit. With me tonight are Dan Goncher and Lyndon Berry, who are also members of the audit team. And we have some slides that I believe will appear. And am I controlling the advance of them, or? Yes, there is a device here. Okay, just.
We have a whole new system here, so we're still checking it out.
Great.
Hopefully it works.
Okay. Okay, great. Okay. Thanks. Thank you very much. And I will walk through the audit scope, results, and findings in a minute. I would like to start with just a couple of statements. One is just a statement about our qualifications, because there have been statements made in the public about our firm, and the 49ers have referred to us as so-called auditors and questioned our capabilities and the fact that we weren't a team of lawyers or a team of CPAs. And I just want to address that and say that we have been in business for 38 years conducting audits of local government operations and finances. We have served the city and county of San Francisco continuously since then, worked for the Board of Supervisors as their contract, budget, and legislative analyst. And we have a similar role in Santa Clara County and have since 1981 as their contract management auditor. And during those years, we have also worked for every major city in California and county, and have developed a reputation for independence and credibility that any of our clients elsewhere will attest to. And I think our ongoing roles in both San Francisco and Santa Clara is also a testament to the quality of the work we do and the credibility that we have. Also, the Stadium Authority issued an RFP, and they did not ask for a team of lawyers, and they did not ask for a team of CPAs. We did have a CPA, by the way, on our audit team. But the nature of the project was an audit. It wasn't a legal analysis. It wasn't a financial audit. You have lawyers, you have CPAs who do work for you, and they have an important role for you, but this was something different. This was an audit of finances and operations of the Stadium Authority. So I just wanted to make that point. Also, there's been statements made in public about changes between the draft and final report. That is absolutely true. We have nothing to be embarrassed about that. We have made changes. We provided the draft, as Mr. Batra mentioned, to the city and to the 49ers in May. We got written comments from them. We have worked with the city staff quite extensively on reviewing records and information, particularly pertaining to staff time and costs that were charged for stadium-related work. It is not unusual for us to make changes, for any auditor to make changes between the draft and final version. What is unusual is for all to be in the newspaper, but that's what happened. And there's, again, nothing to hide about it, but it can be confusing if you don't know the process necessarily. But anyway, we don't believe there were errors that were made, but there were clarifications, corrections, and a lot of work done by staff to find other records and bring us records that helped clarify a lot of the information about, again, something for which there was no records. We were reviewing staff time spent that wasn't recorded as attributable to the stadium. Therefore, there weren't records. We went back, and I'll describe methods later, but it wasn't as though there was a set of records to review and everyone could agree to a final number. I also want to mention that we had a unique aspect of this audit, and that there was a whistleblower-like function that was arranged, and with that, employees were told by the city that they could contact us and make confidential reports to us. And we did have a number of employees do that, excuse me. And we got information that way that was helpful in some cases to the audit, in some cases it wasn't. But it was useful. We're not going to reveal who those employees were or what departments they were from or anything, but there were between 20 and 30 individual contacts made through that. So with that, I will.
And thank you for all that information.
So here's just kind of a quick recap of what the audit questions were, what the scope was, and just some quick responses to it. We have a lot more detail, obviously, that we have in the report, and I'll provide some more detail as well tonight. First question, were city policies and procedures in place to ensure Measure J compliance during the audit review period? The audit review period, just to remind you, was fiscal years 2014-15 and 2015-16. So that started April 1st, 2014 through March 31st, 2016. Things have obviously changed since then, and we'll address that as we go forward, but those were the years that were within the scope. So policies and procedures were a problem. There have been improvements since then, which we'll talk about later also. Was the general fund reimbursed for all stadium-related work, both NFL and non-NFL? The answer to that is no. And at least, from our estimate, $229,239 was not reimbursed during the audit review years for both NFL and non-NFL events. Could revenues and expenses associated with non-NFL events be identified? This was one of the key questions that was set out at the beginning of the audit, and the answer to that is no. We did not have access to the detailed records that's kept by the Stadium Management Company, or MANCO, and we could not access those and report them in this public document. The requirement was that we would have to sign a non-disclosure agreement and not make information that we could look at from MANCO, but we could not make it public. Does information provided to the board give the full financial picture? This was asked sort of in the context of non-NFL event revenues and expenses, but also in the broader sense of the information that has been going to the board during the audit review period. The answer to that was no. We've spent quite a bit of time looking at what we call the budgetary documents, which were both the budgets and the financial status reports that were produced during that 2-year period. And we found there was a lot of room for improvement. The good news, particularly on that, is your current budget and what has happened since then, I think, is greatly improved. We saw a draft version while we were working on this audit for the current year budget, and I think that it's come a long way from what was in place in the first 2 years. But again, during those years, the board did not get the full financial picture, in our opinion, and didn't have all the information needed to provide the needed oversight role and serve as the fiscal stewards for the Stadium Authority. And finally, could parking receipts and off-site parking fees for city-owned property be validated? No, again, this gets back to the records that were kept by MANCO that we didn't have access to, the details on parking operations for both NFL and non-NFL. What we did find is this, the unpaid fees, the $718,803 that haven't been paid yet. or at least as of last week, for use of the golf course for parking. There's been a dispute between the city and the team about that. This isn't a discovery that we made. I mean, the staff is certainly aware of it, but we're reporting it to the board so that they have that information. Just on this topic of the draft to the final report, just a quick recap of that. We submitted the draft to the city and to the 49ers entities, even though we didn't really audit their records, but we had met with them early on, and they certainly are a subject of the audit, so we did provide it to them. And the city and the 49ers entities did provide written comments, clarifications, and corrections. In spite of many gratuitous comments from the 49ers, there were some useful clarifications in there, and we have included them in our final report. We conducted an exit conference with city staff on June 26th, and after that we had a number of follow-up meetings and communications with the finance department and the fire department in particular, and some other city staff as well. We got some new records, we got some other documents from the city staff during that period. So this table then shows what our first estimate was of unreimbursed, I'm going backwards here, pardon me. Unreimbursed staff time was the 424,349. The final estimate was 229,239. Then there were these reimbursements that occurred, and you're probably familiar with this, but the fire department had done its own independent analysis and identified a number of unreimbursed costs and received some money back just as the audit was starting. I think it was in June, for what they identified. We went through an independent but similar process and identified many of the same costs, and they're included in our number as well. But we net them out for what the net reimbursable is, what's left after our total number, less what was already reimbursed. And in addition to the reimbursement for costs identified by the fire department, there was some reimbursement to the general fund based on a provision in the fire department manager's MOU, which allowed for some retroactive payment for time they had spent on stadium management activities. So that gets us to the net reimbursable. What did stay the same after the draft report was submitted is this unpaid golf course fee amount of $718,803. That dispute has not been resolved as of yet. And finally, the use of construction fund, as we went through the records and the payroll records in particular, we found construction fund money had been used during the 2-year audit review period, totaling $894,228, and that was paid for public safety costs, but wasn't reported in the Stadium Authority budget for that year. So you could not see that amount in the budgetary documents that you had available. Audit limitation, I've mentioned that we did not have access to the Manco records that we could report to the board or include in our public document. So this report we knew would be a public document. The requirement from Stadco and Manco was that if we looked at documents, we would look at them on their site. We couldn't take them, and we couldn't report the contents in our report. So consequently, we did not sign an agreement to do that, and we don't have that information in the report. I won't go through a lot of this, and I think you're all very aware of it, but we did start at the beginning with the adoption of Measure J in June 2010, and how the terms of Measure J and the associated non-binding term sheet then got codified into your municipal code. And then a joint exercise of powers agreement was enacted, which established your body, the Stadium Authority organization, as a separate entity from the city. That was in February 2011, and in addition to the municipal code section, there was another section added for dealing with procurement, Stadium Authority procurement. So that 17.20 was establishing the Stadium Authority, and 17.3 dealt with procurement. And this all led to, at the bottom, we have the agreements between the Stadium Authority, city, and 49ers entities, and that's how the term sheet sort of came to life and what you live with now that serves as the guiding principles and the requirements for stadium authority operations. So all those terms got converted into very detailed agreements: the stadium lease, the ground lease, the management agreement, the operations agreement, and many others. Our findings are in 4 areas: compliance with the agreements. We have reviewed most of the key agreements and gone through them in a lot of detail to understand what all the requirements were for stadium authority operations and finances, and have some findings in that area. Stadium authority revenues and expenses, though a key question was about non-NFL event revenues and expenses. We don't have the detail on that for the reasons I just mentioned, but we did look at all the other revenues and expenses and have information about that and how it is presented to your board and to the staff. Unclaimed, unreimbursed city staff costs, a key question, of course, for Measure J compliance was general fund money or any city enterprise fund money used and spent on stadium authority costs. And then finally, stadium parking revenue controls. So I will not go through all the individual findings and recommendations. There were quite a few dealing with the agreements. The agreements are long and detailed, and so we have a lot of findings on different sections of particularly the 4 key agreements pertaining to operations. But I will bring up a few of the key points here. So I guess a recurring pattern that we saw with the agreements and how the stadium authority operated during the 2-year period is there are many requirements for the tenant or the management company, in other words, the 49ers entities, to prepare documents, provide them to the stadium authority, and for the stadium authority to approve them. And we saw a very consistent pattern for those documents that that did not occur. They weren't provided. The stadium authority didn't approve them, and they never became part of the stadium authority repository of documents or the board's record of activity. So key among those is the annual operation and maintenance plan. The agreements require that it be prepared by Manco, detailing the required condition of the stadium, and is to incorporate a draft and final 1-year and 5-year projected shared stadium and expense budget. Because as you know, there are a number of expenses at the stadium that are split between the team and the stadium authority, with the stadium authority essentially covering non-NFL activity and the tenant covering the NFL activity. So there's sort of a logical split there. And those costs are supposed to be presented each year separately, and a 5-year projection provided as well. Next is an annual public safety budget. This is a requirement in the agreements as well, and is to detail the costs for public safety. That's obviously the city's big costs for ongoing stadium operations. There isn't such a thing. Part of the issue is that the public safety function is fragmented. There are different paying sources for it. So for NFL events up to $170,000 an event, that is paid for by Manco and on behalf of the team, but it goes to the city, whereas non-NFL events are paid for by the stadium authority, and that goes to the city, but it's from a different source. So it is within your budget, it appears in different places, and there isn't one consolidated place where you can see this is the total public safety budget, which includes both your fire and police costs. At the outset of the year, what is expected to be spent, and then where you can get reports about what was actually spent during the year. And finally, a capital expenditure budget. The agreements require a draft 1-year and a 5-year projected capital expenditure budget. You do get a 1-year capital expenditure budget in your budget document, and you did during those 2 years, but the 5-year was not submitted and was not included in the budget document. Also, we did not see an annual parking plan, or an annual statement of stadium operations prepared by a third-party qualified CPA, or a detailed stadium marketing plan. Again, these are all requirements in the agreements, and they did not go through this process of being submitted to the Stadium Authority, being officially accepted, and provided to the board. On the annual statement of stadium operations, I just want to make a point on that because this is a little confusing, because you do have an audit done each year by a CPA, and that is prepared. You receive it every year. It's a very standard audit of the financial statements. This is a different requirement, and it calls for, I think, within 90 days of the close of the year, a CPA providing detailed information on expenses and revenues for the past year. So it would get at much of what you have in your financial status reports now, but there are some other requirements in it that you don't have. And most important, it's supposed to be prepared by a CPA to give it independence. Just to follow up on the operation and maintenance plan, again, we were looking at that 2-year window. While the audit was in process, an operation and maintenance plan and other documents that I've mentioned were provided to the Stadium Authority Executive Director. But again, there were no record that those documents were provided during the 2-year period. And the agreements are quite clear. They're supposed to be submitted to the Stadium Authority Board. So if they were informally handed off to a staff person who's no longer here, or other agreements were reached between the parties, none of this was documented, and there is no record on the part of the Stadium Authority showing that that occurred, or a change in plans, a change in agreement was made. And the documents now are not publicly available. They are held by the Executive Director, but they're not presented to the Stadium Authority in a public forum. And we've talked about what the team did not provide, and I just want to point out that there are 2 sides to the equation, and the Stadium Authority during that time didn't have procedures in place either to monitor the requirements in the agreements, make sure that these documents were being provided, and that the tenant was fulfilling their obligations. So the responsibility for it lies on both sides. Clearly, the tenant had responsibilities to provide these things. The Stadium Authority should have been monitoring, reporting to the board. We've received them, we haven't received them. Here's what the contents are, et cetera. There are certain provisions in the agreements, because we went through all of them, that are detailed in the report, and our conclusion was they weren't in the best interest of the Stadium Authority and should be considered for proposed amendments. One is for NFL events, there is the threshold amount of $170,000 per NFL event to be reimbursed by STADCO to the city for public safety costs. And then that amount is netted out for off-site parking fee revenue. That amount was not sufficient the first year of operations. It wasn't sufficient the second year of operations, and I'm sure that is still the case as we go forward. So the difference is being paid for out of Stadium Authority discretionary funds. That's a legitimate use of the discretionary funds, but because of the cap, it means that, at least in the first 2 years, that's what discretionary funds were used for, and did not give the Stadium Authority an opportunity to pursue other projects or use them for other purposes, including, as allowed for in the agreements, some of those funds could be turned over to the general fund if there were excess monies. But with the current arrangement, that will probably continue to be the situation, because the costs have greatly exceeded the $170,000 per event. A second point deals with concession revenue from NFL events. And here there's the concession revenue in general is split so that the Stadium Authority receives it for non-NFL events, and the team receives it for NFL events. But there is an exception to that, and that is when the vendors or the concessionaires don't pay enough to meet the minimum annual guaranteed payment amount if their actual revenues are less than that. In that case, they have to make up the difference, but it goes to the Stadium Authority for all events. And it seems inconsistent with the general pattern, which is split between NFL and non-NFL, and with the city receiving the non-NFL proceeds. Stadium insurance, mostly the Shared expenses are split, many of them 50-50, so 50% of the costs are paid for by the Stadium Authority, 50% by the team. There's an exception for stadium insurance with a fixed amount set for the Stadium Authority of, I believe it's $2.5 million. And that's unusual for the shared expenses. We've been told it was to actually protect the city and set a capped amount, but what we don't know is how much the team is spending on insurance or what the total insurance costs are. That information does not get disclosed to the Stadium Authority. So we think it would be in the best interests of the Stadium Authority and certainly for the transparency of cost to see what the full amount is and to negotiate a shared cost. And yes, it is possible that it could even be that the Stadium Authority would incur a higher cost, but we believe it would be important to at least know what that total is and see what each side is paying. And finally, in the agreements, authority is delegated to the Stadium Authority Executive Director rather than the board for approving a lot of the plans and documents that I've mentioned that are supposed to be submitted. This delegation has run into a problem, at least in the first 2 years, in that information didn't get communicated to the board about what was received, if anything was received, and how and why it was approved, if it met the requirements of the agreements. This was not the current executive director, just to be clear. This was in the first 2 years of operations when someone else was different in the position. But even, no matter who the executive director is, that's not really the point. The point is that the board should be getting that information and know that the agreements have been complied with and the team has fulfilled its obligations. So moving on to the next area of findings, this has to deal with Stadium Authority revenues and expenses. And here, just sort of the overall statement, we have 13 findings and recommendations. Again, I won't go through all of them, but there's some themes that emerge. One is that the board's role as fiscal steward and long-term stadium planner has been hampered by lack of information during the first 2 years of operations. And again, I do want to mention that we've seen great improvement in documentation since then. But for the record, there's absence of key financial and management information in the budgetary documents. The budgetary documents we define as the actual budget itself, which you approve, and then the quarterly financial status reports, which show actual expenditures and revenues. Probably the biggest example we want to bring forward is non-NFL revenues and expenses. There's a lot of money at stake here, and this is, of course, the most important in a sense to the city because that's where you have more discretion and flexibility over what occurs. The NFL schedule is set. There's going to be a certain number of events. That's sort of in the under the control of the team. But the non-NFL has more possibility for the city. So here is a summary. This was something we got from city finance. It's a roll-up. It doesn't appear in the budget, but it represents a lot of different revenues and costs. So the non-NFL event revenue, which was about $51 million in the first fiscal year that we reviewed and $89 in the second, represents concession revenues, parking revenues, ticket sales, proceeds from advertising, whatever, for the non-NFL events, offset by expenses, which could include promoter fees, costs of concession operations, costs of parking, other costs related to maintenance, replacement of turf and facility upgrades and so forth related to the non-NFL side of things. So you can see then the net amount, which is shown there. Also, there is a incentive payment that's made to the management company, a marketing and booking fee. And so that amount is shown to get you to the net, the 5,197,175 at the bottom, and the 6,032,566 for the second year. That, and we show that in red, that's what you get in the budget. So all the numbers behind it and all the various elements of the revenues and expenses are not shown in the budget. And we think that that information should be provided. In fact, more detail than what we even have here should be provided, so you know how much is parking contributing, how much is concession revenue contributing, where are the problems, if there are problems, what isn't making money, what is making money, which events are successful, which aren't. The team and Manco have raised a lot of concerns about this because of their consideration that they don't want certain information to get out. They're competing for shows and acts to come to the stadium. And we are not in disagreement with that. We think there are ways, though, of providing this information. For example, what we have right here is very rolled up. It doesn't give away any secrets or put the stadium at a competitive disadvantage. And we believe there are ways that we could get more information to you folks without jeopardizing the competitive advantage of the stadium. This next table is just to show why we think this is important to get more light on the non-NFL event revenues and expenses. This is a hypothetical, but shows for the second year that we reviewed the $89.7 million in revenue. If that remained constant, but expenses were reduced, and then we run a few scenarios here by 5%, 7.5%, 10%, et cetera. Expenses would have been the amount shown in the third column, leaving net revenue after the benchmark. This would have increased net stadium authority revenue by the amount shown. And then half of that, as you probably know, goes to the general fund. So this just shows what the impact could be of reducing expenses. And not that the Stadium Authority Board would necessarily reduce expenses, but if that information is provided, you would have the information to ask questions and gain insights into where expenses could be higher than desirable or where revenues could be enhanced perhaps, but it would at least allow for a discussion of that could help you as overseers of these events and these finances. Other findings pertaining to the revenues and expenses in the budgetary documents. Details on transfers among the stadium's authority's operating fund, the debt service fund, the capital fund, and the discretionary fund were not fully presented in the budgetary documents during the audit review period. So money is moved from operations, and in the first 2 years, a lot of money was moved, of course, into debt service as you were paying off a lot of the loans and had a lot of extra cash to do that. What you can't see in your budgetary documents is how much came out of operating and went into each of these individual funds. You see what went out in the financial status reports, but there isn't a clear disclosure of what came in and how much then went out from each of them, so that you have clear distinction between funds. Information to demonstrate compliance with stadium lease requirements pertaining to the use of excess stadium authority revenue was not presented in the budgetary documents. So there are very specific requirements in the agreements when excess stadium authority revenue is realized about how it can be used. A certain amount can go into the operating fund. When that hits a certain threshold, then money is supposed to be put into the capital fund. When that hits a certain threshold, more money into the operating fund, and so on. So it's, again, an agreement compliance issue, but it's also a budgetary issue, and one that we think should be presented to the board so you know that those requirements have been met, and you, again, know how much is in each of these funds. And finally, in fiscal year 2014-15, there was extensive debt prepayment, as I mentioned. Part of that was the revenue coming in. You had these stadium builders license revenues greatly exceeding what was expected in the first year. But there was also $100 million transferred from the construction fund into the debt service fund. That was not clearly presented, and we think, again, when there's movements between funds and outflow of money during the year for whatever reason, all that should be disclosed in your budget and financial status reports. The discretionary fund, which I mentioned earlier, is funded from non-NFL event ticket surcharge, but it's being used to pay for NFL public safety cost overages. That is, I mean, that's a legitimate purpose for it, but I just want to point that out, that where the money is coming from and then what it's being used for, it gets back again to the cap on public safety reimbursements that are in the agreement that is in the agreement right now for the team, and that's the $170,000 per NFL event. For the discretionary fund, the problem we had with that and how it was reported during the first 2 years is there was no balance shown. You couldn't see what the beginning of the year balance was, what activity occurred during the year, so how much money actually came into the fund, and then how it was expended, and then what the end of the year balance was. So that's information that we think is important for the board to see. There's also a requirement in the agreements that consideration be given to public safety capital equipment or a general fund contribution when the discretionary fund hits a certain amount. I believe it's $1 million. Again, this was not documented. If such discussions took place, there's no record of that in Stadium Authority records. It certainly didn't come to the board as an item. And then the table below shows an example of what occurred, how the discretionary fund was used during the 2 years we reviewed it. And then a couple of items about, this is kind of getting back to the same issues with the non-NFL event revenues and expenses. There's a lot of rolled up revenues and expenses in the budget document. So stadium manager operating expenses, which was in fiscal year 16, $7.6 million, and the second largest authority expenditure, but very little information about the elements of it in the budget document. So we got some of the budgeted documents from staff, but it wasn't in the budget during the year. This was for, the table shown is for fiscal year 14-15. And we think this kind of information, this level of detail and itemization is important for the board to see, so you know what the costs are, how they're changing. You can compare budgeted to actual and year to year as the years go by, and know what's going up, what's going down, is that a good thing or a bad thing, and give you more information to weigh in on how much is being budgeted. What you see, of course, on the right-hand side is what was provided, and that's, again, the rolled-up total. And then the table down below shows 15-16, just the rolled-up amount, so you can see what was initially budgeted, what was finally budgeted, and then the actual expenditures for the year. The actual versus initial was 1.1 million higher, and this is an example where, in this case, a request was made to retroactively increase this funding amount to cover this $1.1 million, which we recommend not be a policy of the board, that there be a policy that the funds can't be expended unless a budget change has been already approved, so that these retroactive changes don't occur. But tying these two pieces together, it would be important to also know where the increases occurred. So we had a $1.1 million increase in cost, maybe a completely legitimate reason, maybe a good thing for the stadium, but as the fiscal stewards, we believe you should see where that's occurring so you get the line item detail and are able to understand why that increase occurred. I mentioned the public safety budget already. It's required by the stadium lease, but does not exist in the budget as currently provided, and would need to be pulled together from the different pieces of it so that you get the full picture of police, fire, and the different funding sources. This is particularly important for looking at actual expenditures and comparing them, and sort of the key measure for a board like yours, of course, is what did we spend and how does that compare to the budget, and what are the reasons for the difference? And again, sometimes very legitimate things happen. I know in the early years there were more events than expected and probably explain some of the increases in public safety budget, but that's information that should be clearly presented to the stadium board. And the last points there are just about pulling the different pieces together. Then finally, the other expenditures is a line item in the budget. It was $2.7 million in fiscal year 2015-16. It includes utilities, city staff time, this is non-public safety staff time, materials, supplies, et cetera. It's rolled up, so again, the budget documents are just showing the grand total, but our contention is, as we've mentioned for these other areas, that should be broken out so you know how much of it was city staff costs, how much is utilities, where are the changes occurring and why, and the basic management questions that the board would be asking. I mentioned retroactive approvals already. Procurement practices, just wanted to touch on that because we did pull a sample out of the other expenditures, which include administrative expenses, and looked at a sample of purchases made to ensure they were compliant either with the city's procurement ordinances, if they were city purchases that were then used for stadium purposes, or the stadium procurement ordinance if it was a stadium purchase. We found that in our sample that the purchases did meet the city procurement requirements, but we did find documentation was lacking in a lot of the invoicing and contract documentation for 10 of the 29 sample transactions. So we do recommend that certain requirements be made of vendors when they submit their invoices and in their contracts to be very clear about services provided, hourly rates, and so forth. We could not test purchases for the non-NFL events, and this gets back to the limitations on the documentation that I mentioned earlier. So there are things purchased for the stadium in the non-NFL expenses, but that's rolled up to the net amount. We don't know how much that is, and couldn't test it because of the limitation on documents. Moving on to the third area of findings, this is the unclaimed, unreimbursed staff costs. We have 3 findings and recommendations in this area. We do conclude that Measure J was violated during the first 2 years of stadium operations. There were staff costs that were charged to the general fund, some of which have been reimbursed already, some of which are still outstanding. In terms of the procedures in place during that time, the time codes were established so that stadium work could be billed by staff. I think the rollout of those codes and the instructions to staff were not as effective as possible. We did hear from a lot of staff that they didn't know if they should be billing or not. They weren't sure what to code it to. Timekeepers are going back after and sometimes trying to correct what they had billed. So it was problematic and explains some of what we have found is the unreimbursed costs. Last August, a city manager directive was issued that clarified it, gave a more clear direction to staff about billing their time for stadium-related work. There were some changes made to that later in the year that I think tightened that up even further and made it more clear. I think there's some other things that could still be added to it, but in any case, it was definitely a good step to have a clear message from city management about how staff should record their time, and that all stadium-related work should be billed. In terms of our approach, we reviewed 11 sample events, both NFL and non-NFL, and we looked at all the activities that were performed by them. There were a lot of repeat activities by both particularly police and fire, and in general, I'd categorize these as planning meetings. There were a lot of hours spent on planning meetings, particularly in the first year, where police and fire would meet with team representatives and plan for each event. A lot of that time was not billed. There was also a lot of time, particularly on the fire department side, where equipment was moved on days prior to the event, moved to the stadium, moved back from the stadium after the event, and equipment was inspected and prepared for event days on days prior to. A lot of that time did not get charged, and that's a lot of what we have included in our review. We took it for the 11 sample events and then extrapolated it to all the events that took place during the audit review period. And besides, one thing I didn't mention also is something we included had to do with police and arrest activity. There were investigations that took place for certain cases, not most of them are fairly routine, but we identified some cases that required a more unusual amount of investigator time, and that is included in our costs. And in addition, there was post-arrest activity, so that often involved the officers completing their reports after the event day, maybe the day after when they were back on their regular shift, and completing their paperwork and filing it with the records management unit, and that did not get charged. So we have time allowed for that activity as well. We also want to say we think these costs are conservative, that there were a lot of staff who reported to us that they weren't sure how much time they spent, they weren't sure if the time was billed or not. And we couldn't work with a lot of the reports of that nature because it was a little too ambiguous and there really weren't records we could go back to. What was nice, for example, with the fire department is they keep logs of all activity at every station house. So we actually could go back to a source and said, you know, this engine was moved between 3 and 4 p.m. on Friday before the event day. We had some source to go back to. So for some of the activities, that was not the case. Reimbursement. So I mentioned earlier that some of these costs have already been reimbursed. The fire department did its own analysis. They went through many of the same activities that we did. We did not work together. We worked independently. They did their analysis, we did ours, but it resulted in many of the same activities and costs being identified. So that is combined with the MOU change, what resulted in the reduction from the amount we identified to the net unreimbursed amount of $114,781. A lot of costs and staff time were identified to us, excuse me, during the audit that we did not find payroll records showing had been charged to the general fund. And it was confusing because a lot of the staff said, we know we weren't charging it to the stadium authority. We didn't even have the capability of doing that in some cases. But when we finally dug into payroll records and worked with the finance department staff, we found that there were a lot of charges made to construction fund money. So that offset a lot of what would have otherwise been general fund expenses or would have been dealt with perhaps in some other way. But that explained a lot of the staff time that employees thought had not been captured. Thank you. And but the problem with that, the good news, excuse me, the good news about that is that if the construction fund money was used and available, it meant the general fund wasn't used. However, that money was not reported, those expenditures weren't reported to the board, so that information didn't come to you in the terms of reporting actual expenditures. So there was a lot of costs being incurred for the stadium that weren't reported to the Stadium Authority Board. And this also gets to the need for the public safety budget that I have mentioned already. And this is a good example of why complete disclosure is needed. So that had one been in place during these 2 years, you would have not only had the standard public safety activity for NFL games, but also these additional funds and costs that were paid for by construction fund. And you would have been able to see the full picture. Finally, overhead. There is an overhead charge to all staff time that is billed for stadium work. It's 10%. It was a negotiated amount, is our understanding, so it's not based necessarily on a cost analysis of what should be overhead and what should be actual expenses. So we recommend that that be clarified. There are employees unsure if their time is being captured in overhead or if they should be direct billing. The city does have a cost allocation plan that addresses overhead costs for example, when you apply for grant reimbursement. So we think a model like that could be used so that you have a standard amount and employees know if they should be direct billing or if they're covered in overhead. The fourth area was stadium parking revenue controls. We have 3 findings and recommendations in this area. One of the key points on this, and again, we had limitations without having access to the detailed parking records, which are kept by Manco. But we did look through the documents that we could. The city also, of course, gets records on the fees that are received, both the off-site parking fee and the fee for the public parking lots. But we could not compare that to actual lot records to reconcile the two, if the fees being paid were consistent with actual vehicles parked at individual lots. So the potential enterprise fund impact has to do with the golf course and that dispute that is still unresolved. But right now, there's this outstanding payment from the 49ers entities for the $718,803 for the use of the golf course in the last 5 months of its use as a parking facility. That no longer is being used, as you know. The city staff is working to resolve this. If it doesn't happen, it raises, whatever the resolution is, it raises the question of then there would be an enterprise fund impact, and how will that be resolved to avoid violating Measure J, because Measure J applies to not only the general fund, but your enterprise funds as well. So it could end up, if there's an unsuccessful resolution, it could end up being another Stadium Authority expense. Hopefully, that will not occur, but it's information that the Stadium Authority Board should be monitoring. There's no documentation. Well, I want to go back for just 1 minute. The Stadium Authority has audit rights for the parking fees and net revenues for the public and off-site parking that's managed by City Parks. So that's in the agreements now. Audits had not taken place during the years we reviewed. We recommend that the city start doing that. You have the authority to do it already and have an audit program set up so that individual parking operators can be audited and compared to the revenues coming into the city. Finally, there's an agreement in the management requirement in the management agreement that that Manco report on matters related to the off-site parking locations for Stadium Authority events at quarterly meetings with Stadium Authority staff. The meetings, as far as we know, have taken place, but there's no documentation that that this information was communicated or reported. Certainly, it was not done in any formal written document. So again, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a pattern of no documentation of these requirements being fulfilled where information was supposed to be submitted. And finally, there are some other parking operators. City Park is the main one that is under contract with Manco, but there are these other operators, ABM, PCA, and Marvel. They're not under agreement in the same way as City Park is, but they do have to get parking permits from the city. One recommendation we have for the board's consideration is that, and this actually came from city staff, we thought it was a good idea, to include a requirement that the city would have audit rights as a condition for getting permits. So an area to explore might give you additional insight into activities at the parking lots. I will not go through all these audit activities, but just wanted you to have them. This is what the work that was performed as part of the audit. It is in the report as well, so you can certainly look at it there. And I will conclude with that, and we're certainly available for questions, comments, etc.
Thank you very much for that report. I know we have about 89 pages, so you've done a really good job trying to summarize what this audit says. And it's a tremendous amount of work. Thank you very much. You can take a breath for a moment. I'm going to start with Authority Member Mahan. You have some questions.
This thing working, but
Okay. Oops, we're learning.
there we go. I do have a number of questions. And I'm trying to just follow through your presentation as the questions occurred to me. So you said that there was your final kind of conclusion is that there's $229,000 of unreimbursed expenses during the audit period. Some of those have been since put together by the fire department, billed and paid, correct?
Correct, that's correct.
And so there's 114,000 and change left, is that correct?
That's correct.
Has that been billed to your knowledge?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. So that's actually not yet billed, it's accrued and we need to bill it. So we had an experience when we were crafting these lease agreements where there was a lot of confidential information, some of which was held by the team, some of which was held by the NFL, and we crafted a methodology we called it, they called it the black box, where our financial representatives could go in and examine all of the documents and report to us. And we had complete faith in our Kaiser Marston was doing this for us. And so when they were the ones that went in and looked at all of the documentations on site, they reported to us, and we worked from their numbers. They reported to us, much like you've done here with your composite numbers. So why was it that you weren't able to go and do the same thing and just report to us? Because obviously we would have trust in you to, if you looked at them and reported to us that these numbers looked okay, the documents looked okay, or there was problems, you could report that to us.
Yes, we could have, but our purpose was one of our objectives was to detail non-NFL event revenues and expenses. And that
But
was
that's what I'm talking about, the non-NFL, the events that happen at the stadium.
right. And if we could not disclose any of that information, and that was the requirement, I mean, we could come back and say everything's fine, but if there were problems and we couldn't detail them or wanted to disclose some element of it, that was what we were asked not to report. So I think it's different than what Kaiser Marston did, and I understand, they prepared projections, they looked at some core documents and prepared different scenarios for you, as opposed to we were going back retrospectively to see what they had done and how the revenues and expenses shook
But
out.
wouldn't it have been helpful if your review said that, sure, there's a problem, revealed a problem, at least you could report to us that there was a problem, and then we could take additional steps?
Well, we couldn't report what the problem was.
But you could report there was a problem, and then we could take steps to subpoena the
Yeah.
documents or do whatever.
We could, I don't think that would have worked for us because we would need to get hold of the documents
Right.
and work with them. We couldn't remove any of the documents.
Right? But you could have seen them on site.
We could see them on site.
So we don't have that information one way or the other, even an opinion as to whether or not there is a problem or not, there isn't a problem. I mean, it would have been very helpful to know that there wasn't a problem.
I'm not sure we could do that with the requirements of the non-disclosure agreement because that would be in a public setting. It would be based, I mean, it would have to be so high level
Right.
that I'm not sure it would really qualify as an audit conclusion or recommendation.
But if you were satisfied, we would be satisfied with your conclusion. I mean, it's kind of a round-robin argument to say, we can't give you an opinion because we couldn't look, and we couldn't look because we can't give you an opinion. So it sort of leaves a hole in this audit because we still
I
have that.
definitely agree there's a hole in the audit, yes.
But it could have been a hole that was plugged.
Well, I think we see that differently.
Looking at the construction stuff, so there was money used during the audit period for public safety costs. So did you review the final development budget and final financing plan that the council approved in March of 2012?
I did.
So under that plan, as I understand it, and I was on the council that approved it, so was the members that were there, we all approved it. In that plan, the cities, and I say the city and I shouldn't, I should say the Stadium Authority, our portion of it, and it was a line item budget, line item in that final development and financing plan was $7 million. It was later increased to a little over $11 million because some additional RDA funding came in. And it should be noted that none of this money was city money. No, none of it was general fund money. It came from RDA, the redevelopment agency, back when we had it. And out of that construction pot, this was a very small amount, was it not? If you recall?
The amount we reported?
No, the amount, our Stadium Authority's budget or investment in this final financing plan.
Okay,
Because the final financing plan was $1.177 billion.
that's right.
Now, when we drew down on our, do you remember what the purpose of that line item for the city, or
The 7 million, are you
the
referring to?
7 million, which became 11 million?
What I recall is it said for Stadium Authority operations and city costs.
Right.
Right.
So it was appropriate to bill those public safety costs against that line item money. In fact, I think that's what we did over time, did we not?
Well, our point is it wasn't disclosed in the Stadium Authority budget.
But
So
it was,
there were-
okay, my question was it wasn't that a proper use of the money?
Yes, and we're not saying it
Okay.
wasn't a proper
Thank you.
use of the money. It was a matter of disclosure and
because-
transparent budgeting.
The last component of that financing plan, because it was a very difficult financing plan to cobble together, almost $2 billion. NFL contributed $200 million. The Goldman Sachs put together private financing based on revenues, bond financing of several $100 million. And then the rest came from $450 million from construction lenders, which is being paid back. And then that last gap, in order to fill that last gap without having to expend any city funds, Stadco, which is stadium company, the 49ers company, so to speak, guaranteed a loan up to $450 million, $500 million, that the Stadium Authority could borrow against to fill any gap in construction funding. So had the $11 million not been available to us in that final financing budget, we would have just had to borrow more from Stadco. I mean, isn't that right?
If I'm following you, I think that's right, but
Okay.
yeah, I haven't gone through this in any details.
Okay, I just want to make sure, because of course the initial report was that this $890,000 was city money and we lost it, or we should have had it, or it should have been paid to us, but that's not in fact true.
Well, that wasn't our statement. I don't know.
I know, I'm
who's
not
been
saying it
that,
was,
But what
but-
we're saying is there was an expenditure. It explained a lot of the public safety costs that were being reimbursed. It was not a number that was in the Stadium Authority budget for those years, so it was sort of a shadow budget or set of
But it
expenditures.
was in the final financing budget, and the reason it
But
wasn't.
it was moved to the operating, to the extent it was used for operations, then it should be in the operating budget.
And that may be, I can see your point, but in the operating budget, it was the normal $170,000 a game kind of operating stuff going forward that was in the budget, but we exceeded that. I mean, we exceeded that from year one. We tried to make it, the best estimate, but once you exceed that, then we had to pay those costs from some other source.
The discretionary fund, and that's in the
that's-
budget as well. So you have
Right.
the NFL, you have the discretionary fund, you
Okay.
have the Stadium Authority piece for non-NFL, but you didn't have this other piece,
Right,
$894,000.
okay. So to the extent that we used that $11 million line item in the final financing budget, it simply reduced what we had to borrow from Stadco, reducing the overall debt.
Yes, I mean, the money would have had to come from somewhere to cover these costs.
And so if in fact reports were given to the Stadium Authority CEO, but not to the Board of Directors, I mean, whose responsibility is that? Is that the team's responsibility? Is it Stadco's responsibility, Manco's? Is it
Well,
this?
excuse me, I would say it's on both sides. The agreements are pretty consistent in the pattern of the 49ers entities shall submit,
Right.
and the Stadium Authority shall approve or adopt one of those words.
Okay.
So both sides should be doing it. But, I mean, where we
Does it say
say,
who to submit it to?
to the Stadium Authority.
Okay. Thanks. And I agree with you. I think they should be, and I think they should have always been, and I'm not certain that it's, anyway. So and I'm referring now, it was number 9, I think that was the page number, but on the slide is number 9. When you made these scenarios and you extrapolated information to get to these bottom lines, were actual numbers available for all of the non-NFL events?
Well, in terms of employee records, there aren't necessarily actual numbers because this was uncharged time. So it's going back and recreating some history. There are records of activities that occurred, but employees didn't necessarily record their time as I moved a piece of equipment today for the Stadium Authority. So there isn't an actual record of that, but there's a record that the equipment was moved and, you know, how many, say in the fire department, how many employees were involved in that activity.
Okay.
So that's
So
the
the-
record you start with.
And the fire department was able to reconstruct from its records these additional billings that they had. Were other departments able to reconstruct?
Some, yes, like, for example, in the planning meetings, we didn't have sign-in sheets showing, you know, who was there, but we were able to discuss those with the employees or the staff of the departments and find out who went, who typically went. There wasn't a record necessarily of, you know, individual names, but mostly the staff remembered, you know, there were 4 of us, it was 2 lieutenants and 1 cap, whatever. So it was, a lot of it was assembled that way.
Okay. And who is supposed to present or prepare the budgetary documents?
There's a requirement in the agreements that Manco provide the budget, but they work with the city staff. So I would say it's a joint effort.
Okay.
Because they each need information from each other to assemble
All
it.
right. Okay. So again, it's probably a shared responsibility. I mean, since they have to work together, they should have been working together and neither side was. Is that kind of your read on it?
I'm not sure I'd say they weren't working together, but the information provided had limitations. I think, you know, the 2 sides worked together and assembled something. You did see budgets, but the budgets had some deficiencies.
On another slide, it was 22, where you showed some increases. Did your review, even though these were composite numbers, did your review explore where the increased funds were spent?
Oh, on the,
I was looking at page 22.
get back there. I don't think we had access to that information. This was maybe on slide 12. Is this what you're referring to?
I had it as slide 22.
Oh,
but-
okay. Well, does this table look familiar, though?
Yeah, no, yeah, but that wasn't the one I was thinking of.
Okay, right. No, and that was sort of the point of this, is that you don't get that level of detail in your actual expenditures, and we think you should. So exactly to your point, so you could determine where the increases had been and why.
And then on slide 14, it said 14, you said things should be itemized, and they weren't, but were you able to, even though the report didn't itemize them, were you able to substantiate them, the amounts?
The amounts were certainly, they were rolled up, so we were able to, we got this detail, let's see, I believe this is from the city itself. So yes, I mean, we consider those legitimate numbers.
Thanks. And in the procurement, you said you sampled 29. How many procurement documents were there?
Total?
Yeah.
There were many. I wish I could give you the precise, I could give you the precise number, I don't have it
Well, yeah,
right with me.
ballpark.
I don't know. Thousands?
Thousands, you say?
Hundreds? Yeah.
Thousands?
Hundreds, definitely hundreds.
Hundreds? So
Yes.
you found 10 insufficient out of 29, so
Yeah.
what's your extrapolation of that? I mean,
We didn't
are you going to
extract.
say 10 out of every 29, or, I mean, just as a random
Yeah, I mean,
number?
that could be one conclusion, but we didn't really structure it in that way. We took a random sample.
just a
We looked at this.
random-
If this occurs in 29, you know, you would expect that there would be repeats
But
of
you
that as you
don't
go on.
know.
I don't have that number.
And that's a pretty small sample out of thousands.
I think we chose it
Even
for,
hundreds.
I'm gonna have to turn to you for it. You know, to have a certain margin of error and a certain statistical confidence. But it is a small sample, but it, you know, I don't know. Do you want to address this, Linda? Sorry, Lyndon Berry, who
Lyndon
worked on
Berry.
this.
Yeah, so we selected the sample not to do any sort of 95% confidence interval or anything to make any sort of extrapolation like you're talking about. It was more that we had found these two categories of expenses and we didn't know what they were, and so we chose a sample of a few different categories, and we chose expenses to sort of take a representative sample, but not in any way like, a confidence interval, no statistical significance. The goal of it was more discovery and not to make any sort of.
So your conclusion then is not that the invoices were incorrect, just that they may not have had the backup documentation.
That's correct.
To back them up.
Mm-hmm. When we say deficient, I mean something like the invoice didn't have a sort of line item if you're talking about, number of hours for an engineer. There was no record in the contract to sort of specify what the engineer's hourly billing rate was. So we couldn't verify it like that, but nothing we saw exceeded the not to exceed amount, nothing we saw seemed out of the ordinary.
Okay, good to know. So the takeaway may be that we just have to be more precise in the records that are kept on all of this.
Right, and we do have recommendations to that effect. I think just, if I can speak to about the 29, and as Lyndon said, it wasn't to extrapolate, but if it occurs in 10 out of 29, these are randomly selected, so I doubt that they're the only 10 in the entire. Yeah.
Right, but again, you can't say that it's a proportionate amount.
That's correct.
And I appreciate that. So I have really one burning question, and it's probably not something that you can answer, because when you say you talk to staff, and I really appreciate that, because I know that staff spend a lot of time on a lot of stadium stuff, and they reported to you that they didn't know if they should bill. Now, since we've had Mr. Batra as city manager, he almost immediately, one of the first things he did was to institute a city manager's directive, a CMD, to do just that, to tell staff, report your time, blah, blah, blah. So if prior to Mr. Batra's tenure here as city manager, interim city manager, if staff didn't know if they should report the time or not, is it a fault of the staff? Is it a fault of the team? Is it a fault of the stadium authority? Is it a fault of the, and I'm not asking, maybe fault's the wrong word. I don't want to assign blame. Who should take responsibility for correcting that problem?
Right. Well, I think the city manager issuing a directive was, in fact, a response to that and taking responsibility, and that is the message from the top, and that's where it needs to start. Obviously, everyone in the departments needs to be complying with it, and it has to flow down, but the message definitely starts at the top.
And since the CMD's come down, and in your interviewing with various staff members and in this entire audit process, do you feel there's a need for, and this may be just an opinion, not asking you for a recommendation, I mean, is there a need for additional education of staff as to what they report or how they report? Does staff seem pretty clear now?
I think it's definitely improved. We've heard that from a number of employees. But yes, I also think the message should continue to be communicated. Well, it's like anything. It does not hurt to repeat it and to remind people, even if you're spending 30 minutes on a stadium-related activity, that needs to be charged, so the general fund isn't.
I'm an attorney. Nothing gets billed at less than 12 minutes.
Okay. Well, 6 minutes maybe, right?
Oh, 6 minutes? Okay. All right, actually, I think I've covered, the golf course, that was one last thing. Now, this is in dispute, and I just wanted to clarify one thing. When you say there's $718,000 outstanding in costs, and it might cost the city, but it's not an actual dollar, it's not an actual cash cost, in the sense that it's actually the difference between what we normally get on golf course revenue and what we may have lost due to the team's use of the golf course. And that's the heart of the dispute, is this loss of revenue because of the team's use of the golf course or other factors or a mixture of both? And we're pretty far apart on any answer to that question. But I just wanted to clarify that the city isn't out that money, so to speak. The city's seeking reimbursement of some amount that's attributable to lost revenues on the golf course. Is that right?
Lost revenue, well, yes, lost revenues on the golf course, which translated into the fees being paid. So I think it was $250,000 a month, more or less, that was expected, and would be enterprise fund revenue, that if it's not recovered, then the enterprise fund, the golf course, is out that amount of revenue. It's not a cost in the same way as paying for a police officer's time, for example.
And that's lost revenue if it can be proven that it was due to the NFL events. The teams
No, I think
used-
it's a little different than that, because that was a set amount. I mean, there was an arrangement with the team to pay that amount every month. The team has disputed that.
I think Stadium Authority Attorney would like to answer
Okay.
that question.
Okay, thank you.
With deference to the council member, we have this on closed session for Tuesday, the
okay.
golf course dispute, so I'd prefer if we not
I
have.
will
it.
stop my questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ross.
Thank you. Stadium Authority Attorney, Authority Member Mahan, are you completed your
yep.
line of questioning?
I do what the city attorney tells me. Tells me to
Stadium
shut up,
Authority
I shut
Attorney,
up.
you had your light on for a while.
Yeah, no, I just had two discrete comments. One is on the issue of the records. I just wanted to remind the full council that I'm not sure what Kaiser Marston was looking at, but the records that we were asking our auditor to look at are the records of the Stadium Authority itself. So the non-NFL records belong to the Stadium Authority, so they are our own records. And what's inappropriate is that we're not being allowed to look at our own records. And we should be in charge of the audit of our own records. The other point I wanted to make is on the budget issue. And I wanted to just simply advise the council that exceeding the budget is prohibited by the management agreement. So under section 2.6.20, Stadco is required to notify the Stadium Authority with respect to the annual Stadium Authority budget of any expected material variations from budgeted line item revenues and/or expense projections as promptly as is practicable after the stadium manager becomes aware of such likely variation from such budgeted amounts as set forth in any such budget previously delivered to Stadco and/or the Stadium Authority. So I do concur with the auditor's findings and recommendations that no expenditures should be made prior to approving a budget adjustment. If the budget is going to be exceeded, they have a duty to inform us as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Authority Member, Vice Authority Member, I have to figure out how I'm going to say this, Caserta.
Thank you, Madam
Vice
Mayor.
Director.
I was enthusiastically supportive of this $200,000 audit. This question will be for Mr. Berceau and our Finance Director. The $114,000 Finance Director, how much of that has been substantiated? And are those real numbers? Can you tease that out a little for me, please? And Mr. Berceau, feel free to add on to that as well.
Vice Chair, maybe I can start with the answer, then I'll give it to Angie.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I think I put your light on.
So can I preface my comments before I say anything? Number one, it's been a pleasure to work with Harvey and Rose. They did their job, and we provided our comments to them, and it's been a very cooperative effort, and that's where we are. Staff still believes there are some philosophical differences in the numbers, and that's in the way of answering your question.
Yes.
So, for example, the 140,000, you heard from Mr. Brousseau that they took, 11 sample events and then extrapolated the numbers. Staff's numbers are still lower than that because those were based on actual time cards. So if 11 events, if let's say, for example, 4 people did something, and then to assume that for every event, those 4 people worked on that for the same thing, it may or may not have happened. So we went by the actual timesheets. So that's where a little bit of philosophical difference. I'm not disputing the numbers, what they presented, but staff's number is still a little bit lower, and that's why when question was asked, have we not billed? Well, because you can't bill from staff's perspective based on estimates or projections. You have to have real numbers.
So were you, I know you got the report a little later than you initially thought, but do you have numbers from your perspective? You said it was lower than 114K. Do you have numbers from your perspective?
Yes. Again, I'm not giving you precise numbers.
Yes.
We are in the range of about 20 to 25,000. That may have been missed. Now, even that can be qualified because everything was not clear at the time. I mean, like anything new, there was a learning curve, and certain things may have been missed or not clearly identified for staff, what to charge, what not to charge. So, for example, if HR were to spend time in retaining or hiring police officers, now, should their time proportionately have been charged to the stadium authority? And I'm hearing, yes, we should have, and that may have been missed. So in this report, I also want to say that we've been anxiously awaiting the recommendations going forward. If certain things were missed, going forward, we want to improve upon that. There were some issues you may have heard through the audit committee that, after arrest of some individuals, if PD has to go to the courts, whether that time is chargeable or not, we are told, yes, that time should be charged. Stadium is one-off. Going forward, that's the direction. We will charge it. So those kind of things may have been missed. And so our guesstimate at this time is 20 to 25, but I'm not disputing their numbers. I'm just sharing with you staff's perspective.
So we see a delta between Mr. Berceau and your numbers. We'll say liberally, you said 25,000. He says 114,000. I'm not a math teacher, but we're saying 85,000 less from your perspective. Are you going to be billing that soon?
Well, the board has to adopt the report. If that's the case, then we will.
Okay. Thank you for that. I want to also go to the March 2012. My understanding, Mahan, Gilmore, and Kolstad were on the council at the time. And please feel free to correct me, City Clerk. It was a unanimous vote for the final development budget. Can you talk about that process? It was a line item of 7 million, ballooned to 11 million. Basically, it gave latitude for the finance director for the city to build the stadium authority, and the Niners were not involved in that. I just want clarification on that perspective first, and then one more question on that.
Okay, I have to answer this from backwards.
I'm
back.
sorry, it was 6-1, I guess McLeod voted in the, yeah. Okay.
So
Thank you.
the 7 million, from my understanding, was for staff costs. You know, finance was doing a lot of work, the board was meeting, those types of costs. And so I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? Because I lost my train of thought.
Just the process, it was a 6-1 vote, and all three members that are here now voted for it. So my question was a line item, and just the process, my understanding, and I tried to read through it all, is the city would build the stadium authority, so the Niners had no control or purse strings over that. Can you clarify that? And that was given to the latitude of then Gary, the finance director?
That's correct.
Okay. So my question then is if 894,000 is not owed by the Niners, Mr. Berceau and staff, why is it in the report?
We did not say it was owed by the 49ers.
So it was not owed by the Niners, okay.
We
And
said it
then,
was the use of funds that wasn't disclosed.
and there was no impact to the general fund on that, is that correct?
It prevented impact on the general
Good,
fund.
okay, very good. And I appreciate the city attorney clarifying the golf course issue. My next question was, I do agree with the city attorney that we should be in control of our own records. I agree with that. My question, Rajiv, from a high-level staff perspective, and Mr. Berceau already mentioned this, and Councilmember Mahan did a good job of that, so I don't want to repeat that. But from your perspective, you were given access to all the records as well?
Okay, I see the ring now. So as reported to Stadium Authority Board previously, it was a few months back when myself and the Director of Finance at that time and the City Attorney at that time, three of us did go to the stadium headquarters, and they did have, a lot of documents in a conference room. And I reported even at that time, we didn't thumb through each one of those, but we have a list of those. So they were made available from that perspective. Now, if it was up to us, we could have spent more time reviewing each one, but that day we did not do that. And my understanding is, and Mr. Brousseau can speak for himself, that similarly, they were made available for the auditor as well.
And the invitation was to us as a board as well?
That's correct.
Okay. I'm really glad we did this report. I think it's worth the 200,000 in regards to the recommendations moving forward. I appreciate that. So thank you.
Thank you. And just point of clarification, it was 180,000, but close to 200.
Authority Member O'Neill?
Thank you, Chair. So, Mr. Brousseau, thank you for the very detailed report. It's very interesting. So I kind of wanted to start with whether your firm has had any other experience in dealing with this kind of, say, either entertainment or sports venue?
Yes, we have. In San Francisco, we have done a number of analysis of stadium operations and venues operated by the city and county.
So I think one of the things that's been a little uncomfortable for, at least I can speak for myself, and it has, and I think been raised, is the level of either the aggregation of the data or the fact, the whole, issue about whether the data needs to be kept private and, cannot be shown, even though we're now hearing, well, you can come and kind of look at it. But in terms of what you would typically view as, say, a fiduciary responsibility in terms of how you examine and use the data, is that an issue that comes up at the other similar type facilities that you are aware of?
I can't think of a direct comparison where that would be the case, but I think just in the general sense, when we look at public budget documents, we're looking for disclosure, no matter what it is, whether it's a entertainment site or not. But what is unique here is that there is confidential business information, but that's, as I think about it, that occurs many times, like in public contracting and so forth, and there are ways of getting around that so that proprietary information or information that would put a business at risk can be dealt with, and information needed for the public agency, say in reviewing contracts and making that, reviewing proposals for a contract and making that public, certain information can be redacted so that the businesses are protected. And a similar arrangement could certainly be managed here, in our opinion.
All right, so information that might be of a proprietary nature that would impact the ability of the stadium authority to compete for certain types of events.
Right.
Can be exempted in some ways from either FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, or California Public Records Act requests.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
And your attorney could probably advise you best on that, but that absolutely can be done and is done in a number of circumstances.
Okay, so, some of the concerns in looking at the document, there's obviously a lot of, sometimes I realize, when your gut's telling you something, you should really pay attention to your gut. I always say about myself, whether I'm an intuitive analytical or an analytical intuitive. But from kind of the beginning, when I came on the council, I had some concerns in terms of how, operationally this was going to be executed. And I know the police department and the fire department and the streets department spent a lot of time in planning their pieces of what was going to be done. I know even at Silicon Valley Power, there was work on making sure that the lights were going to stay on the stadium. And, and this is, looking at it for us introspectively to look back as to how we have functioned as a stadium authority board and staff. Did you see evidence in all these many, many documents that you looked through that there had been a comprehensive or detailed plan or thought put through or together about how we were going to manage at a overall level a $1 billion facility?
Right. This is an interesting question. I mean, certainly the public safety plan was assembled early on, and that covers a big part of your function. But I think what you might be getting to also is sort of the administrative side of it. And we didn't really see that I mean, there are these requirements in the agreements, but there wasn't an overall plan about how it's going to be managed. Frankly, your management staff for the city has been fulfilling that role, and I think that's been challenging. I mean, they are running a city also, and this is no minor enterprise on the side. So I think that's a good point, that that side of it perhaps could have been better fleshed out at the beginning.
Right. So, maybe perhaps the thought that we had all these agreements in place, that it wasn't going to, that's where most of the, the managerial operations were going to happen on the side of the 49ers and the management company, as opposed to the actual stadium authority.
Right. I mean, the management company was delegated a lot of authority, but someone has to oversee the management company too.
Right.
And that's...
Right. Okay. So one of the other things that I've had some, thought about is, for a long time we were hearing about the cost allocation study that was going to be done, I believe was done once the stadium construction was complete, but I don't recall that we ever really saw, we were hearing that, the results are looking good. Did you see evidence like of the detailed results of that study?
We did not see the detail. We saw a summary document. It was very high level. I know the detail is in the city's financial system about what the draws were and what was left at the end, but we did not go through that.
So do we know that there were funds were there funds that came back to the stadium authorities or city?
Yes, I mean, just as we were discussing earlier, the $7 million, for example, that came to the stadium authority is part of that.
So were a lot of the costs were there, but were there actual construction costs in that allocation study?
The allocation study, as I recall, was showing what was left over and what was available. And there were definitely funds left over. I mean, the total construction was not as high as originally anticipated.
Right. So I think that's kind of been one of the areas of concern, is the construction fund, because we're hearing that construction, came in a little bit under budget, and in this issue about whether other costs were built into the construction fund. I mean, that was news to me, that other types of costs, if they were not directly construction related, were going to be allocated. Am I understanding you correctly that it was allowed for other costs, other expenses other than construction costs were being charged against that?
Right. With the funding that remained, for example, $100 million went into debt payment, and the $7 million was appropriated for stadium authority and city costs. The record after the initial $7 million of what was appropriated each year, what was spent, is the problem area that we bring up, because we can't trace that then, particularly to the 2 years we looked at. It was how much was available, how much was appropriated for public safety costs and so forth.
Okay. So when was the construction fund closed out? Did you?
I think I defer to city staff on that. I'm not sure I have that.
It would be 2014, right? 2014, that's when the operation started.
Right, so that's what it would,
That's why we
because I thought it was, I thought, maybe I misunderstood, I thought, I was hearing that it had been left open for a while. So, but it did, the construction, because I realized we went from construction operation to, when we did the takeout financing.
Do you have the exact answer?
So I believe the substantial completion was received in 2014, but construction, I believe, was still open throughout that time. So there were, as Mr. Brousseau was saying, that 894 was charged, it was like startup costs, it's pre-planning costs. Any event costs were actually charged to the actual event. These are costs that we didn't have discretionary fund at the time because that's part of the ticket surcharge, right? So it is my understanding that, and we still had budget of that $7 million from the DDA, from the construction, that's what we used that for.
Okay, all right. Thank you. So one of the things that was kind of problematic for me from the very beginning of when we were operating the stadium was, and I had a number of discussions with the prior Stadium Authority Executive Director about this, was the change in what I would call, what I've been known to call the change in the scope, the scope change that, our public safety being police, fire, dispatch, everybody had to take on. Did you see any evidence that there was any discussion about the fact that the scope had changed significantly on public safety, and that should have triggered the reopener of the, regardless of the time period, but that since what originally was, when it was priced out, what this was going to cost, and then when the parameters of the services that needed to be delivered changed, did you see any evidence that there had been a discussion between the city and the team about changing the cap on what the payment per game?
Right. I probably want to defer to city staff on those discussions, but I do know, what I can say is that there was definitely an awareness of the expansion of scope, or the needs kept changing as the stadium opened and events occurred. It became more obvious to the public safety departments that there were other needs, and they would need to provide other services or resources to fulfill the needs. Or some things you just wouldn't know until you're running a stadium, I guess.
Right.
In addition, I think a lot of the initial staffing and modeling, if I understand it correctly, was based on Candlestick Park. So very different configuration of a stadium and different public safety needs and so forth than your facility. And also times have changed. So there are different needs that came up. Security concerns about terrorism are probably much higher now than they were in the early days of Candlestick Park.
And as you mentioned, Candlestick, like the fact that, where our stadium is located and where it is, you've got many, access points. So I think that the use of CHP, like the fact that, 237, 101, the expressways, 880, that perhaps led to, perhaps if they were basing it on Candlestick, that some of the pricing or figuring out what was actually going to be required, it became obvious that there was a much broader radius of where we were going to need public safety assistance.
That's right.
Okay, so something that came by, I just wanted to make sure that it was clear on this, like there was some references made to the NFL's contribution into the construction costs. And my understanding was that was a loan that was folded into the takeout financing, and the NFL was repaid that money. It was not a contribution into the cost of the stadium. Is that correct?
I'm quite sure there was a loan, and I probably shouldn't speak to the details of that initial financing. That wasn't part of what we reviewed here, and I am not familiar with all aspects of it. But again, probably staff could speak to it.
Okay, so I appreciate some of the additional information that Angie's provided this evening about the 7 versus the $11 million. So those costs were supposed to be, just in the, kind of additional development costs into getting the stadium going. And I know Angie did point out that there wasn't a discretionary fund at that point, but the understanding was that was to, whether it ultimately got folded into the takeout financing or not, that it was appropriate to use those for operational costs?
I think the initial appropriation was for stadium authority expenses and city costs. That was the way I read the document. And that was in 2012. And so there were several years that passed with different appropriations that may have occurred, but when we got to the 2 years we reviewed, there was no appropriation in the budget for the construction fund. If it had happened in previous years, it wasn't carried forward or presented in a way that made it clear in the budget that it was a resource being used and how it was being used.
Okay, so you did mention this, you mentioned talking to members of the planning department about meetings that they had gone to. So, I remember at the time when all the construction, the project was approved, that there was going to be funding for an additional planner that would be working in Santa Clara's planning department, that, those costs were to be reimbursed. Was that outside of the scope, since you would not have had access to look at that data, whether we were actually ever, were paid for that planner?
That's
Since
correct.
that probably would have been in the construction phase?
Right, that was not in our scope, that's correct.
Okay, all right, great. That's all I have for right now.
Thank you. I'm going to take Councilmember Watanabe's comments, and then we're going to take a 10-minute break before the actual Stadium Authority meeting at 7. And Mr. Brousseau, I know you're going to make a smaller version of the report at the Stadium Authority meeting.
Certainly.
We'll start that up in the beginning and then continue with the questioning. Authority Member Watanabe.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Brousseau. Based on comments that I've heard, I think this was definitely $200,000 or $180,000 well spent. You've shed a lot of light on a lot of questions and concerns that people have had, and I've learned a lot as a result of reviewing the report. So I appreciate all the comprehensive time that you and your staff have put into putting this together. It seems to me that what I'm gathering from is that there's a lot of inequity in how costs are being distributed between the Stadium Authority and the team, and so I'm hoping that as a result of this, a lot of that inequity is going to be resolved. I want to go back to the report, a finding and recommendation that was made. It seems that there was a breach of the management agreement and the stadium lease in 2014, 15, and 15, 16. And I was wondering, number one, the stadium, as Stadco, they've been made aware of that. And number two, going forward, you mentioned that there are changes being made going forward. Is that part of the change that's being made?
I think the breaches that we point out here often have to do with the delivery of documents. Mm-hmm. So certainly this is a public document, and the 49ers have seen it. They completely disagree, as far as I know, about whether or not they produced the reports that are required, produced and submitted. And that's where it gets tricky, because we don't see any record that they were submitted, which is what the agreements state. So I'm not sure that that's changed now, but probably the staff can bring you up to date on whether or not things are being delivered to the Stadium Authority in a way they weren't in the first 2 years.
Stadium Authority Attorney. And then the Executive Director.
At least some of these failures or breaches, as the auditor refers to them, are the subject of the declaratory relief action. If you recall, the city, before I was city attorney, the city sent a letter to the 49ers, mm-hmm. and then the 49ers sued, I guess, the Stadium Authority in declaratory relief, and then we have countersued in that lawsuit. So some of these breaches are the subject, or alleged breaches are the subject of that lawsuit. Mm-hmm. So probably not a good idea that we talk too much more about them. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just to indirectly answer your question, also to say how we bridge the gap or closing the, gaps, so to speak. When I took over as the executive director, it was not just a title. I had my staff go through all the agreements and the deliverables and milestones, whether it's a monthly meeting or quarterly meeting, and what are the deliverables. So we came up with this matrix. I haven't given it to you, but it's for my use. But we are following up on that. And some of the deliverables, as Mr. Brousseau points out, they were not done previously, but going forward, they are being, and I'm not saying we are perfect still, but we are trying to make progress, and that's why we were anxiously waiting for this report also. I mean, part of it is financial, part of it is performance type of thing. So we are trying to improve and do the best we can.
But I was going to say, one thing that, I mean, we've learned from this report is that, I mean, the stadium authority should be.
Definitely, yeah. And we were, I mean, yes, it's a combination. We were doing it ourselves too.
Right.
But these recommendations help that. So.
Okay, great, great. Okay, let me just go through my notes here real quick. I made a couple of things. I know that you mentioned, I guess it's going back to the proprietary information and the SADCO not wanting to give away secrets. Have you talked with them also about, you know, some of the ways that you discussed, you know, that or this information can be shared? Because obviously it's information that's going to be able to help our staff be able to put together the budgetary information that they need.
With them, who are you referring to?
STADCO.
Oh, no, we have not had any discussion.
Okay, okay. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Brousseau. We're going to take a 10-minute break and then come back and resume as the Stadium Authority Board.
Thank you.
Thank you. I didn't want to go straight.
Well, just to clarify, 229 is we can bump because, yeah, so that's because the city has several